Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with George Ryan, who's one of our consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider, Talk Cyber. So today, George and I are going to be talking about what organisations can do once they've got the Cyber Essentials framework in place. So first of all, George, Cyber Essentials provides a framework of fundamental security controls that organisations should really have in place. Could you just give us a quick rundown of what it covers?
Yeah, sure. So with Cyber Essentials, it's kind of aimed at covering you from about 80% of attacks. With that, it's kind of broken down into 5 main parts. So the first one of this would be kind of your firewall, so making sure that you got the correct ports open, you're reviewing what's allowed, it's acting correctly as it should be. You then have your kind of secure configuration. Again, it's how your networks is everything actually configured to an acceptable standard from a cybersecurity perspective. You've also got your access control, so not everyone should have access to everything, obviously. Your malware protection, so whether you've got that in place for all your endpoints, for example, what you're using, and patch management as well. So again, that one, it's just making sure you're using the supported versions, the latest versions, not letting anything fall outside of a 14-day period. Within those, that's going to be covering things such as usage of multi-factor authentication, making sure that your passwords are following a certain standard, so 8 characters with a deny list, minimum 12 characters, having MFA, etc. And other stuff like permission creep, so making sure that you're not letting everyone be an admin and run around with admin privileges, making sure that upon change of a role, permissions reflect that. So yeah, 5 main areas that then delve a little bit deeper just to make sure that essentially your organization is going to cover against most of the basics, which is unfortunately most of the attacks we get.
And what frameworks or standards could organisations put in place once they've completed Cyber Essentials?
Yeah, so obviously it goes without saying that if you have done your Cyber Essentials, a logical next step might just be to then look to do your CE+, so your Cyber Essentials Plus, which is essentially going to be an independent technical audit and a vulnerability scan based on what you've said during your Cyber Essentials. For those looking to kind of go outside of Cyber Essentials and look at next kind of steps, you have things such as ISO 27001, SOC 2, or NIST 2.0. And these are a bit more there's a bit more to them, so to speak. So definitely a bit more advanced than the Cyber Essentials and what they will be covering. But obviously what you've got in your Cyber Essentials is going to set you up well for starting to implement them. So a lot of things that are in ISO, SOC and NIST, Cyber Essentials are going to be touching upon them.
And how can organisations go about enhancing their security without implementing those more complex frameworks such as SOC 2, NIST or ISO 27001?
So yeah, for a lot of organizations, it might just be, we've done our Cyber Essentials. This is great. We're not looking to do another standard. We can't, essentially we don't have the budget at the moment. It's going to take up too much time. That's absolutely fine. What I would suggest is you start to kind of look at, well, what are these standards actually trying to get us to implement? With that, you can kind of see the key takeaways. So they're all going to be fairly similar in what they want you to do, but you might have to do it a bit differently. So essentially, you're going to be wanting to look at things such as asset management. So do you actually have an asset register that lists all your devices? Because shadow IT is a massive issue. You can't protect what you don't know you have. Have we accounted for all our laptops, all our servers? We've not accidentally got something gone. When someone's leaving our business, okay, what happens to that laptop, etc. If we don't have that detailed somewhere, it's going to be quite hard to protect against it, and it can be easy to forget. So kind of one thing I would suggest is, looking at your assets, documenting your assets, maintaining a register of your assets. Equally, you can start to look at incorporating risk management. So based on this, let's say we have our assets. Okay, let's actually start looking at them and what risks they're presenting to our company. We can then say all I'm not a massive fan of this risk, actually. I'd like to either use a third party to reduce it, or I want this risk kind of gotten rid of. Equally, you might say, well, actually, I'm okay with this risk, I tolerate it. That's fine. The main point is that you want to actually have an overview of the risk that is presented towards your organization, and Cyber Essentials doesn't necessarily cover this. And again, risk management, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to do it the ISO way, you don't have to do it the NIST way, etc. But the concept of it is something that you can incorporate without having to certify to a standard or to attest to anything. Equally, I'd be looking kind of towards business continuity. So, again, with our Cyber Essentials, we are touching upon preventing disruptions, etc. But it might actually be that you go, okay, at some point it might be that we face a disruption. Let's actually look to how we can prepare for that, and we can actually keep our operations running during such an incident. These things, they happen. It can be something totally outside of your control. Like I'm sure people might remember quite a while ago, there's a very well-known security company that brought out an update, and that kind of halted everyone on a Friday for a bit. Some people were unable to operate effectively. It's about preparing were such a situation to happen. How can we maintain business operations? Do we have backups just in case something is down? How can we continue going? Kind of similar to that, we can also cover our incident management. So incidents happen, they can happen to any organization, but how do you actually prepare for that happening? So this might be, and we'll touch upon it a bit more later on, but looking at detecting incidents, how you would respond to such an incident, how you would escalate it. Would it go to line manager? Would it go straight to the top? Are you aware of duties to notify authorities, regulators? Are you aware about the time limit you have to let the ICO know if you've got an incident? How are you planning to communicate that if you have to communicate externally? And again, that's totally separate to the standards. You can do that without having to certify to a standard. That is the theme for all the bits we're covering at the moment. These aren't specific to ISO. They're not specific to NIST. They're not specific to SOC 2. They're all things that you can take from them and implement yourself without having to go through them. You can do it separately. So kind of the next one I'd be looking at is our supplier management. Let's just think here, we've done Cyber Essentials. We've shown we've got a verifiable level of security. We've got something to show for it. Well, chances are you're using suppliers. Your data is probably going to be with suppliers. Therefore, they are essentially an extension of your security. So at that point, it's kind of important to think, how am I managing my suppliers? How do I know who I'm using is also conscious of security? Because you don't want to put all the effort in, and then this other organization that you use, the supplier, actually has terrible security, and that can then impact you. But you've done your Cyber Essentials, you've thought about things. It's important to extend that. This can be, in some cases, as simple as saying, okay, well, we're only going to work with suppliers that have this certification. For example, Cyber Essentials, you might say, well, we've got Cyber Essentials. We know that's a certain level of security. Let's just make sure all the suppliers we're using are actually using Cyber Essentials. So next, I would say, security training and awareness. In Cyber Essentials, we cover, how to encourage users about following the password policy, having strong passwords, etc. But as I'm sure many organizations are aware, security training awareness extends far beyond that. As part of compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation, you might already be delivering training to employees on, data protection principles, etc. So in fact, we can just look at extending that to cover wider topics. So remote working practices, for example, not going to your local cafe and taking a Teams meeting there about confidential information, for example, being aware of surroundings, being aware of potential phishing that could go on, making employees aware of actually how you would report a suspected incident, etc. So equally kind of on that, it's also important to start potentially looking at having more of a regular kind of audit and monitoring. So your cyber essentials at the moment, it's really good. And that is going to make sure that you are following it annually. So each year you will have essentially a refresher to check you're doing the right things. And cyber essentials may change the next year, so maybe you have to do things slightly different. But potentially for your organization, it might be worth looking at kind of maybe having quarterly audits, for example. Are the policies that you've got in place in your organization being followed? Is everything going to plan? This might be that you might want to set up things such as key performance indicators, your KPIs. Well, okay, how many incidents have we had in the first quarter of the year? How many have we had in the second? Are we going up? Are we going down? Do we need to adjust our security, because of that? And again, these audits, we say internal audit and monitoring program. If you're not certifying to ISO, obviously that doesn't mean you need to have someone come in and audit you to ISO. The same with NIST, the same as SOC. What we're saying here is actually just having the audit on your organization to check that you are keeping up with, best cybersecurity practices, the policies that you have in place for your organization. Let's say you have everyone must have a 12-character password. Well, is that being kept? Again, with the incidents, are you actually making sure that you're not having many incidents? Are they being reported correctly? Are there any areas where you're saying, okay, we keep getting issues here? So kind of related to your incidents, and again, we briefly touched upon it earlier. So with Cyber Essentials, you are kind of looking at prevention. It's mainly prevention. There's not a great deal of detection there. So based on that, your organization might say, okay, well, we want to supplement our cyber essentials, and actually maybe it's time that we start looking towards some form of detection. We don't just want to prevent and react to an incident. We want to know that we can detect where one to happen. I'm sure if you look at some of the cyber stories in the news, you'll see that some people were hacked and they might not realize till months later because they didn't have any way of detecting it. Again, this detection, it can be agnostic. It doesn't need to be a certain standard way. It can just be implementing the features standalone. That's fine. It might be that you go out and you say, okay, we've found this company that do this software which performs this detection. Okay, that's going to monitor our network traffic. That's going to collect logs and identify patterns that might say, oh, it looks like this could potentially be an incident. You've just had this amount of data leave the organization. It's going to cause an alert. It can be easy as that. It doesn't have to be ridiculous. This where you're not looking towards a framework or a standard with some of these potentially is you can decide based on your organizational needs what is best for you. If you're a small 2-3 man organization, you're not going to want to spend hundreds of thousands of some state-of-the-art detection feature. But what you might do is you might just go, say if you're running Azure, you might say, okay, well, what detection can we pay for through Azure, the license, etc. I think one of the big things at the moment is to consider the usage of artificial intelligence. So this can be as simple as outlining a policy in your organization, what can be used for AI, what can't be used, what can be input, what cannot be input, what AI should be used, what should definitely not be used. Essentially just kind of giving you organizational control. It might be as simple as saying, yeah, we can use AI, but you have to use your work email. We don't want it on your personal. It might be just saying, okay, look, it's Copilot only, guys. This is all we're going to allow. It doesn't need to be super sophisticated. You might, again, start with this policy, see how that goes, and then look to scale up from there. So essentially just to list them again, without giving a massive explanation for each, but you can look towards your asset management, your risk management, your risk treatment, running business continuity to prepare for disruption, incident management, in some cases, incident management workshops. So actually playing it out, because who wants to test out their incident management plan day one of an actual incident? It's going to be chaos. Supplier management, are we putting ourselves at risk with this supplier? What supplier should we be picking? How should we be aware of who we're picking and what they're doing with our data? Training awareness for our staff, how can we make them more aware? How can we help create a culture that is cybersecurity aware within our organization? Our internal audits and monitoring, how can we make sure that we're consistently performing to a satisfactory level in terms of our cybersecurity? We're not having many incidents, we're not having many issues, downtime, implementing detection, and then finally looking to cover the usage of artificial intelligence within the organization.
Amazing. Thank you, George. And I think, as you alluded to earlier, a lot of this stuff will help organizations implement those more complex frameworks, those more advanced standards when the time comes. So having this stuff in place is only going to help you sort of scale up your security program when the time's right. Thank you very much for your time today, George. And for any of our listeners that want to learn a bit more about this subject, we've got a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, that George has kindly written for us, which is called Supplementing Cyber Essentials. So go and check that out, and thank you very much for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.